guys, it's me. I'm back.
What's up, party people?
We're like, Mads, come on. All right, this show is taking a turn for the.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Monster Bass Live. We got a great show for you today. We are talking all about the spawn. I'm going to be joined in a little bit by Chris. Raphie is man in the chat. We are going to do the best we can. He's not man in the chat, but he's managing the tech behind it because Fixie decided to take a paying gig that has him photographing beautiful women in swimsuits, and he picked that over us. I'm not quite sure why, especially since we're talking about the spawn today. So we're going to give him a hall pass, and we're going to do the best we can. As always, we're grateful that you took the time out of your day to be here today. I had an interesting weekend. So I went backpacking, and I took all the little scouts backpacking into the middle of nowhere. And of course, along the way, I'm identifying plants like poison oak and all this stuff. And who's the one person that gets poison oak? The guy identifying it. If you could see my legs, I look like I've got adolescent acne up and down my legs. Why? Because I was the one pointing it out, making sure that they didn't get it. Of course I did. Go figure, right? We're not going to waste any time today because I think the spawn's an exciting time. And I think the approach I want to take today is like, I want to learn a lot because I can go out and I feel like there's a lot of people on the line today that know how to fish. They know how to, they know what to tie on. They know what they like. But like when the spawn comes, there's a lot of crazy stuff happening. I mean, you know how it is in your life when you're spawning. Like, it's nuts. Well, with bass, it's no different. So we're going to get to the bottom of it, and we're going to bring in our resident expert, Mr. Wishiwazfishin, Chris Hollingsworth.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Hey, I like when you're spawning. Having 6 kids, I guess we've spawned a few times around here, and you've spawned, yourself. So
well,
it's a crazy time, right?
The resident expert, right?
Expert of spawning.
Yeah.
I'm nervous. I'm nervous to get into this. I think pre-show I was telling you this whole understanding of what fish are doing. I think the more education we give people, women might start to try to identify as female bass, and we'll get into that later because there's distinct differences between what the male's responsibilities are and the female. But man, it's a crazy time. And what's cool is no matter where you live, whether you're down south and the spawn's been going on and it's almost post spawn and the fish have already hatched, like the babies are out there in the fry, or where I'm at, we're just getting them up on the beds. And then up north, they're like, what are you talking about? We still got ice and the ice isn't gone. We can talk about the spawn, whether it's pre-spawn, truly spawning and mating, and then post spawn. We talk about those behaviors. We're going to pinpoint exactly what it means to catch those fish. And I think it's going to be fun.
I love it. So for the person that's tuning in for the very first time or they're new to fishing, I mean, I'm sure everyone gets the general concept of what the spawn is, but how would you break that down for them?
All right. So I'll go into it and try not to go too deep, but you have this wintertime haunt and the fish pull off the shore just because the water historically is warmer down deep than it is up top. And the metabolic rate really drops below 50. So when the water's under 50, the fish are kind of calm. They're not swimming a lot. They're not feeding a lot. You can still catch them in the winter. And we talked all about that, but now we have the water's getting above 50. So this uptick in the metabolic rate, the fish start feeding. They start thinking about swimming more. They're more active, and they know historically. So you think back in the beginning of time, we've got this meridian. And so the equinox, the days, it's the winter solstice. The days start getting longer. The fish are keyed into that. And so that plays a lot into it is now we have more sunlight. the angle of the sun it's a more vertical angle. And the fish know historically that happens the same time every year. So that's a big indicator of kind of when the spawn should be. But then it all comes down to that 50-degree temperature. Above 50, the fish start getting active. They start swimming. They start looking for food. So they come out of this deep wintertime haunt. They're moving up into these staging areas. We talk about the pre-spawn. And so now we're like, pre-spawn, what's going on with the fish? Normally, the biggest fish in the lake are going to be females. That 4 to 5 pound breaking point, most of the fish above that are female fish. And I don't know why that is, but that's just what nature has done. And so those female, they're moving up, they're starting to feed historically again. And some of this information, it may not be this way where you live, but the biggest fish historically spawn first. They're metabolically advanced. They know what's going on. They're older, they're bigger. And so they're going to move up and get towards those beds. So now we've got this pre-spawn that's happened. And at the same time, we get closer to the spawn at 56, 58, almost 60 degrees. The boy bass, and this is what I was teasing about, the men are up on the shore. So you have all these male bass clearing beds, and they've got to clear away the debris. They got to get the substrate nice and firm. Normally, and we've seen some change of fish. They will spawn out on the main points now, but historically they're back in the back bays, the shallower water. You can spawn in an area where the water is going to be consistent. So I can't say that it's 2 to 3 feet, because if there's a lot of water clarity and the sun can get down there, they can spawn a little deeper. But historically it's at 2, 3, 4 foot range for largemouth bass. And it's an area protected by wind and the waves, just because they don't want the babies and the fry and the eggs to get beat up. So the boy bass are up there, they're cleaning the beds, they're making sure everything looks nice. And then you have all these females that actually, it's kind of funny. I was teasing with my wife. It's like this girls' night out. They come and they parade around and they get in these, it's like they're the staging groups. And it's funny because bass, if you watch them, they hang out by size. Specifically because big bass hang out with other big bass, and it's cool with forward facing sonar. You get to see this out in the deeps. That's why you see guys are like, oh, there's a bunch of big bass. They don't fight when they're that same size. They're not eating each other when that same size. So size is so important with fish. The schools, when they're schooling, normally they're around similar size fish. So now we have all these bigger females cruising the shoreline, and then this whole courtship thing starts to happen. And the boys come out and they nudge at the females and they rub on them and they try to bring them over to their beds. And there's this whole discussion in science whether they're forcing them or they're leading them. And so that's this funny movement. But now you get up to the spawn. So I think we could probably stop there, and that's where they get, and they're actually going to go and lay their eggs. And this is where it's, we got to be considerate of children listening in and learning all this with us, but this is nature, folks. So
Sure.
The pre-spawn is a really important part. You can catch a lot of really big fish because they're still feeding. I think the cutoff is to remember, male fish stop eating, and they stop eating when they go up and they start preparing that bed. They actually, scientists, they'll harvest fish and they'll cut them open, and there's no excrement. There's no poop really in the fish because they're not eating. And so when you catch a male bass during the spawn, when it's up to that point where they're on the beds, they're not normally feeding. I throw this out there, the 4 F's. Bass know exactly what's going on in their water. If you throw a bait, it's either a friend, a foe, it's food, or it's forgettable. It's not like you throw a bait and the bass is like, oh, I didn't notice your bait. They know exactly what's going on. It's, if I don't care about it and I decided that it's not going to be eaten, it's not food, it's not my friend, I don't need to come over and investigate it. If it's foe, that's normally what you're doing during the spawning phase for male bass, is you're throwing something that's going to disrupt their bed or eat the fry or whatever, and they're going to come over and they're going to take it and they're going to relocate it. They're not really looking to eat it. So I'm sure you got a lot of questions and things, but it's fun to realize when you look at fishing tournaments now, they're making it specific on visual bed fish. You have to show that you caught that fish in the mouth, because it's really easy to throw a big bait with big treble hooks and foul hook a fish, because if they're locked on their bed, and that's normally indicating that there's actually eggs there. If they're locked on it and they're not moving, you can foul hook and snag a fish.
They're basically trying to swat it away, and then you foul hook them.
You foul hook it. They're coming over and they're kind of hitting at it. And I'm not a big advocate of that, but it's like there's specific techniques. And we'll get into my top 5 baits later about how to make sure you're catching them in the mouth or giving you the best chance. But I think backing up a little bit, because we have a lot of people. I'm Northern California. Anybody above that meridian line, Northern California across the United States, they're still pre-spawn. And you get up in the north, and I know some people still have ice breaking out. They're finally getting to where they have open water. They're getting their boat out there and they're like, where are these fish at? It's pre-spawn. And so you got to look for these staging spots where these fish are moving up. Fish need to eat. They need energy to manage the spawn. And so that's that pre-spawn piece. So with that information, I'm sure you got some questions out of that, because that was a bunch of info.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of questions. So specifically between the male and the female, I mean, I know you got into their behaviors and the things that they're doing during this time, but if you're dumbing this down for someone that's new, basically the males, once the beds are made, the males are protecting it.
Yeah. And they're courting. So it's interesting. The males move up, and a lot, like in turkey hunting, you call them the jakes. I don't even know the actual term for a smaller boy bass. It's really funny because, and I don't know where this all came from. It's like, oh, I want to catch the big bass. And we start talking about them as females. And it's like, whether, I don't know, is your car a female or a male car? There's all these different things, but realistically, when you're it's a car. I know, but some people, they have these associations with gender. The biggest bass historically are female bass. Sure. And so it's like, it's an interesting concept when you're catching small shoreline fish pre-spawn. They're almost always males. When you talk to a scientist that does this for a living, there's a pretty good indication of how to look at a male versus female. You look at the jawline. There are some, I caught a 6.5 pound male bass, and it was all bloody and its bottom fins from preparing the bed. And that's a phenomenal male bass, but historically it's female. So you really break this into this gender identification of what's going on in their behaviors. And then you can decide, if I'm in a tournament and I need to catch the biggest bass and only the males are up and they're making the beds, well, then you got to think, okay, where are the females? Well, they're just off from the shoreline, and they're probably, some of the biggest ones are ready to investigate. They're probably not going to be taking really big baits that are moving super fast. They're feeding, this metabolic change is happening. The hormone change is happening. They're filled with eggs. They can be 10%. Some scientists will argue it's like, oh, they can be 15 to 20% bigger. I think right now the consensus is around 10%. So you get a 10-pound bass, easy math here, public school, it's got an extra pound of egg weight. So now you're talking an 11 pound bass. So if I'm in a tournament and I'm weighing my fish, that's the fish I want to catch. You're looking for you're targeting the biggest female. So that's the interesting piece. The more you learn about the spawn, those female are only on the bed for like 1 to 3 days top when they're truly mating in the actual spawn. So a female locked on a bed is not very common unless she's laying her actual eggs. So then that comes to that whole question, like, is that ethical to catch a fish? I'm not here to argue whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, because I think those are fighting words with people. But as far as bass fishing and understanding when the female are on the bed, if they're on the bed and you watch them and they're rolling and they're probably laying their eggs, that's actually what's happening, is why the female is on that bed.
Now, is there ever a reason why a female who wants to mate doesn't?
It's interesting because the males, they'll say sometimes, because a lot of the males will die. They don't eat almost the entire time. They're protecting the fry. They say in the north, some of the males are finding only spawn every other year. The females, I guess, if they came up, there's a lot to do with temperature. And so if the temperature drops, and we had that, it was so nice here like 3 weeks ago, it was like almost 70. And then all of a sudden it came back to 30 degrees. And that change, the fish are way smarter than us just on temperature. For us, it's like, oh my gosh, I get cold. Their bodies actually shut down because they know when their body temperature acclimates to the temperature needed for the eggs to survive, you'll notice the fish hang out at that depth. So if they're like, oh, I'm going to spawn in this consistent big lake and it's about 58, 60 degrees at 4 feet, even if they're not on their bed, those fish oftentimes will hang out at that same 4 foot depth. They're suspending, and their air sac is holding them there. You can tell when you watch a fish if they're finning or if they're sitting still. If a fish is sitting still, its air sac is holding them right there, and they're acclimated to that depth. And that's because they're trying to acclimate their body and the eggs. And that means the sperm from the male fish doesn't need, like they have to all match temperature wise for things to work. It's kind of like you think of an egg and a chicken, an incubator.
Sure.
You got to have the sunlight. You got to have the warmth. It's got to be consistent. And so that temperature change, when you're asking, like if a lady comes up and she's like, oh, this guy's good looking and his bed sure looks nice, if the temperature drops, she may take off. She's like, I'm out of here. But it is an interesting concept, because female bass, like 30, 40, 50, maybe even up to like 60, 70,000 eggs, they don't always just spawn on one bed.
Right.
And so there's some really cool stuff. Is the bigger fish normally spawn first. And then because they have their metabolic needs taken care of normally early, and then they'll kind of move offshore, the little small 10, 11 inch male bass will come up and they're making their beds later on the season. And then some of those big fish will actually come back and spawn again. That's when nature has a way of taking these little fish and mixing the big fish genetics with them. And so it kind of is a natural evolution to make sure the fishery is a pretty healthy fishery. So it's kind of cool.
It's kind
Crazy,
of
right?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's kind of like cycles being in sync.
It's almost like it's been figured out a long time before we came here messing with it. And so we're just observing all this and watching it. And it's just really fun. The more you understand and the more you know, like, what can I put in front of this fish to catch it? I'm just going to tell you, if you want to catch staging fish, and some people are like, I'm too cool to throw a Cinco, a Neko rig, a Cinco, wacky hooked.
Yeah.
If you imagine this big, dumb, easy worm falling and fluttering right down in front of the big female bass, it's in maybe 6, 8, 10 feet of water, and it falls right in front of their face, they just puff their gills, suck it in their mouth, and you can catch them. So simple. They don't have, if you think of an animal that's only job is to survive, it's not wondering what it's going to watch later on Netflix or anything else. You serve it up this perfect meal right in front of its face, and it just decides to eat it. It doesn't need to swim after it. Doesn't need to waste any calories or energy. You present it a big, simple, easy meal. One of the easiest ways to catch fish is just throwing around a worm in that 6, 8 feet of water in that pre-spawn.
And tell me again the ideal temperature for the spawn.
So when it gets to that 50 degrees is the metabolic change from winter time into the movement. And that 58, 60, bass will spawn up to 70 plus, but that 58 is like, okay, now we're getting spawn time. Now we have fish that are going to start laying their eggs. And it's like that magic of 60. I think a lot of people will talk about that. The temperature isn't exact, again, because some fish will spawn when it's a little colder, some when it's a little warmer. What's really cool is you think about the bluegill. The bluegill will spawn as soon as it hits 70. It's like dead on, and as many months as it's 70. So it's like this whole nature thing is like one of the best forage foods for bass are these baby little bluegills. So you have these bass that come in, they lay their eggs, and the fry, it takes them a little while. They start growing like day 17, 18. They suck up the egg sacs. They have their bladder. They're swimming around. They're eating the zooplankton. And then all of a sudden they're almost big enough to start going over and eating Mr. Bluegill's babies. So it's just all these things that work by nature, but the bass historically get to go first. And so because the bigger bass tend to spawn first, then they go away, and sometimes they come back and spawn a second time. Sure. Conceivably, I could catch a pre and a post spawn bass in the same area of the water. You will. You'll catch the young males kind of cruising around, a little more feisty and active. I catch those with jerk baits. That's one of my top baits, again, to use. We'll talk about those baits, but you'll catch fish in the spawn, pre-spawn, post-spawn, all together at all the same time. And you got to understand where they're at and where you're targeting them. If you're just going around and driving around looking at beds, like I've heard one of my buddies, John, he was on the show. He talked about a guy in a tournament. He found like this double digit on a bed, and he went and protected it the day before the tournament so nobody would catch it. And everybody's making fun of the guy. And he's like tried to keep it secret, and then he was going to go back, and then that fish had moved off his bed, and we just couldn't stop making fun of that guy, which is awesome. But there is that thing where you see this 10-pound fish. And I have one memory that just haunts me. And it was years ago, and I was fishing in the Delta, and it was a tournament, and I didn't really have the whole bed thing figured out. And I just saw this fish. It was up in the shallows between these tulies. And of course, now I know exactly what it's doing. It's a female, and it's probably laying its eggs. I couldn't get it to take anything. And now that I think, it's like, oh, it's probably almost impossible. I know some tricks now, some really crazy things to try that I can share later. One would be to throw a buzz bait into that bed, because now you have this huge buzz bait, maybe with two. And I know you have this new buzz bait. Most people don't think about throwing a buzz bait into a bed. But if you think about this huge, big debris and trash and metal, and it makes all that noise, and normally there's some gravel and rocks, they absolutely hate it. So the problem with the buzz bait is if they go and pick it up, they have an awful good chance of not getting the hook in its mouth. But if you throw a buzz bait, into a bed, and I'm not telling everyone to do that. It's just you're harassing the fish. The chance you have of disturbing the bed and killing thousands of fry is also present. So we had some boys over at our lake here the other day, and they're throwing these huge glide baits with 3 treble hooks right on the new beds. And they're just trying to catch fish. And I understand it. And it's like you educate somebody, like, how important is it for you to catch that 3-4 pounder versus the 30,000 eggs that it's laying?
Yeah.
And I think the cool part of fishing is if you understand what's going on, those fish, the tiny fry eat like we got phytoplankton and zooplankton. You have algae that's blooming. That algae is a food source and a calorie that our big bass can't get. It doesn't eat it. It eats smaller, fish. So in order to get this new algae bloom and this grass and all these different things, we need the phytoplankton and zooplankton to eat that food source. It brings those calories up into the food chain. So then we need the fry to be eating that zooplankton to bring those calories up into the food chain. So unfortunately, there's some cannibalism that goes on because the big bass do eat the baby bass, but that's why they have 50, 60,000 eggs. And the bigger ones, for us to get those nutrients into having these big bass, we do need a successful spawn. We need those eggs to hatch. We need them to grow. We need them to eat that calorie source to then transfer it to the bigger fish. So I think it's important to really understand what's going on when you're fishing on a bed and you're disturbing the spawn. There is that chance that you're kind of messing things up, and it's not so much like I'm hurting the fish, you're hurting the future food for a lot of fish. So it's an interesting.
Yeah. Well, speaking of big bass, if you guys haven't done so already, I love to celebrate some big catches or whatever it is that you've caught recently that you're proud of. So when you get a chance, head over to the trophy room, monsterbass.com/PB, upload your catches. Next week when we're back and we've got our show ready to go and we're back at a full complement of people, we'll upload some of those pics and celebrate you and share them with the community. Because that's what we're here for. So, you brought up a topic, Chris, and I guess that leads me to my next question, like the spawn. I mean, should we even be bed fishing? I mean, you kind of touched upon it briefly, but like,
that's scary. I'm telling you,
I'd love to know. Like, we definitely have we have some people on the line, and at some point we'll get to them. But like, I mean, it feels like there's this. It seems like it'd be easy.
Yeah, it is.
But is it right for the future of our sport?
I love it. So sorry about bringing that. Hey, by the way, Liquid Death.
There you go.
This stuff is insane. It's so good. The Grim Leafer, I think it's called.
I'm going to the fridge to get one while you answer this question.
Yeah, I'm going to answer it. And so I have a fly fishing background. I grew up fly fishing, and the Puda Creek is here in California. And if you go down to Puda Creek, and I'm not condoning violence or somebody attacking a car, but if you were down there fishing during the spawn, or you're walking the shoreline in the gravel beds, disturbing it, people might mess up your car. And that's this whole understanding of, is fishing during the spawn very sportsmanlike? I'm not going to sit back and condemn it and say I've never done it. When I see a big bass and it's up on a bed, I've been known to try to catch it, but luckily for me, there isn't that extra pressure to try to catch the biggest fish on the bed, because the tournaments that I've done, they just haven't been where the fish are up on beds. A lot of times guys are like, I'll never fish beds. And then they're just blind casting to the shore and they're still catching bed fish. So yeah, it's like the only thing you can do to not catch a spawning fish, especially pre-spawn, post-spawn, whatever, because maybe it's worse to catch it post-spawn. When now you talk about disease infested fish and you have all these bruises and cuts and scrapes to stress a fish out and catch it and put it in your live well that's bloody, that's probably the worst thing you could do to fish when you're talking about potential bacteria growth. And so post-spawn fishing may be worse than pre-spawn. So I'm not here to argue. I'm here to educate. I think the idea is knowing what's going on with your fishery, knowing if you need to catch a fish, the best way to catch that fish. Fish handling is really important. If the fish, it's like if you see a fish and it's spawning and it's 3, 4, 5 pounds, if that's not going to like win the tournament, maybe just let that fish do its business. The pre-spawn, I think, is something to really key in, because not every fish is going to spawn at the same time. And when I was making that joke about girls' night out or these bigger lady fish kind of moving up, and the staging, I think that's one of my favorite times you think about staging and migrating fish. I like to think of it like as a truck stop, and I like to travel in my car a lot. And I always think of my favorite, whether it's Love's or Mavericks or whatever, and they have all these wonderful snacks and food. Like
Sure.
you bring all these big bass and they're holding at a staging spot and they're waiting for the temperature, that consistent, like 58 degrees. They're ready to be caught. They're easy pickings at that point. And you determine in your lake, is that 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet? Where is this stage point where they don't have to waste a lot of energy to get to spawning? Pre-spawn, people talk about first points, secondary points. If they're really trying, like going long distance in a river back to a spawning bed, those fish are going to make those migrations and then refuel at their truck stop. And so that's the feeding spot. It's like they're pulling up. You're going to give them that easy snack. And that snack, sometimes whether it's a worm or some kind of a spinnerbait or whatever, we'll jump into that. But I think when you understand fish behavior, it's so much easier to catch the fish because you know where they're at, you know what they're doing, you know what they're going to do next, you know what they're looking for. And then you get to just entice them with whatever bait. It's like you get to pick your own favorite way to catch them at that point. It's kind of fun.
Mm. And so when you talked about when they're staging, so are they staging, I don't care whether you call it secondary point or whatever, but they're staging in an area with some structure, right? And
so it's cool. So you think of this fish that hasn't needed to eat a lot during the wintertime. And then all of a sudden this metabolic uptick says, hey, you need to eat and you need to swim. Yeah. And when you swim, you burn calories, so you need to eat some more. So it's like, I need to eat. Where is their first area of ambush of feeding? And what are they feeding on? Are they going in after smaller fish? So they move up and now they want warmth. And so that's why the first thing you start looking for, like maybe are there trees, and are they holding next to trees or those rock outcroppings where the sun is warming it up? So all of that plays in. Plus bass historically are lazy. They're going to sit somewhere where they can ambush feed. They're smart creatures that have lasted, I don't know how many millions of years they've been around, but they're doing fine. And it's just up to us to make sure we don't completely screw it up. But bass used to be they were over 20 pounds a lot. And that's this thing is like, we're all talking about maybe selective harvest or what have we done to change what bass have looked like. But historically bass, their job is to survive. They procreate, they eat, the cycle is over and over. So they come out of this winter water, they're moving up to stage and to eat. And that's why I tease about the truck stop. It's like when I go to a truck stop, I'm putting food in my car, I'm putting food in my belly, and I'm cruising down the road. And that's what a bass is doing at these staging spots, is they're there to really. And so that's, if you key into that, you can find hundreds of fish in a lake that are in similar spots because they're staging in the same staging locations. And oftentimes it's the biggest female bass. That can be your most rewarding, to find them staged and pulled up, and you catch fish after once you get it going.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, bass are pretty much like 90% of the guys watching this today.
Yeah. I'm just telling you, this is like this whole gender identification.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's like, so you have this whole thing as you're eating, you're trying to find the best connection with the best mate. You mate, and then that's why I was teasing about women.
And they're lazy.
Right. It's like the dude. Here's the switch. Bass, the guys do so much of the work. So we haven't even really talked about the spawn. Like the guy's up there making the bed. He's sacrificing his lower fins. He's clearing off rocks. He's all bloody and beat up. He's doing all the work. And then the lady comes in and lays the eggs, chills out for a couple of days, and then bolts. And then that guy is like full on daddy daycare and takes care of the fish, swims with the brood, protects the fry. It is complete role reversals from what I've seen in my life of my wife taking care of the kids. And that's why I think Kelly would be the first candidate to wear a shirt like, I'm now a female bass, or I identify as a female bass. Like the guys do a lot of the work in the bass fishing world. And so the ladies, they got it made, but I mean, I don't know. What does that take to like pass 80,000 eggs? I'm sure that's not super comfortable. And then you have like guys pecking at you, like female bass get beat up and cut and bugged. But I was funny. I was reading this scientist report, and he was talking about like the male bass come over and they massage the flanks and the vent and the cheeks. And I'm like, this gets so inappropriate so fast. I was like, this whole bass fishing world is pretty adult humor out there. But no, it's fun to learn what the fish are doing. And then if you're ready to fish, I'm curious if we got callers. I wonder if people fish during the spawn or what, like what baits they use. And we'll jump into that in a little bit, but no, it's just so much information that we're learning. And then now it's cool that like I mentioned, the forward facing sonar, we're learning more what they're doing offshore. It's like this crazy weird world of, we don't really know that much about like what great white sharks do when they go and they mate. This is like offshore bass fishing in the wintertime. We're getting to see exactly what bass are doing. And then they move back into the shore and you get to watch them. That's the cool part about the spawn. I love walking across the street and you'll see the boils, and the boils are these bass chasing off the bluegill, and you can see exactly what they're doing. And the bluegill are swimming behind the bass. And it's just this just constant game of, can I get into the bed? Can I eat the fry? And it's just cat and mouse game. It's super fun to be involved in and watch it.
Well, I think that I should be really grateful that that this is the show Raphie's not on, because I think with this topic, we might have been able to go off the rails really quickly. Like, we might have been able to set a new WrestleMania record. I don't know.
We may have been censored. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm doing my best. I was going to do a post pre-show, and I'm like, it's just this whole sensitive subject, to not sound too misogynistic of like what men's responsibilities are. Women identifying as animals now is like a thing that's going on in the world, and I don't want people to take it out of context, because, you know, like, hey, if you want to be a female bass, be a female bass. But as far as the spawn, the ladies seem to have it made. Like, they cruise in, they're hanging out, they're showing off their winter gains and their curves, they lay some eggs, and then they bolt. So I'll tell you, it's cool though, because I have caught some of my biggest fish in that pre-spawn staging. The one thing though is everyone's like, oh, that fish is spawned out. That would have been a 20 pounder. So
what does that mean?
Post spawn, there's all these people that hold up these fish and they're like, it's a 7. It would have been a 10 if it was during the spawn. That's so 10%. That's something to really focus on. 10% is egg weight. You might have a little metabolic loss, so you lose the egg weight and then a tiny bit of extra calories when you're not eating. Those fish have not lost 2-3 pounds. They're losing that 10 to 15% top. So when you're looking at like what the fish could have been versus what you're holding, you might just be holding up a really skinny, poorly malnourished fish post spawn, because your fishery might have too many mouths to feed. So those are some, it's just that topic we always hear, like, oh, that would have been a PB if it would have been post, pre-spawn. That 10% may have brought you to your PB, but that's post-spawn fish don't weigh an extreme different weight.
Sure. We do actually have a couple of calls. I don't know if we should take them or not, but why don't we go to that? What do you say we go to that 815? Go ahead, caller. Where are you from?
Good evening.
Hello.
I'm in Frankfort, Illinois.
Welcome.
I'm southwest of Chicago.
First time caller?
Yes.
Excellent. You got a question?
I've got a stupid question.
No such thing.
You see all these ads and guys selling like garlic infused plastics and everything else. At this time of year with the spawn, will bass even pay attention to something like that, or is that so far out that they, it would just be a waste of time for someone to try it?
Great question. So I have this discussion with my buddies all the time. I don't use any scents or bait infused, but I have a friend, he's a phenomenal fisherman, and he takes, every time he does soft plastic, I don't care what even on trailers on like a chatterbait, he'll sit there, put his needle in, squeeze it in, anything that he feels will give him that tiny bit longer for the fish to hold it in its mouth, where the fish bites down and it can differentiate between hard plastic, hook, whatever, or they like the scent. He likes to have that scent. A lot of times the salt has a lot to do with floating or not floating. And some people confuse it of like, oh, with a fish like salt. I don't take the time to do any scents, but I also don't catch all the fish. So I'm just going to tell you that the visual presentation that you get, if you imagine in the old days, illegal now, spraying a lure with WD-40, it displaces from the petroleum product being underwater. So if you imagine when you go swimming in the ocean and you're in salt water. Yeah, no, we'll go there.
Wait a minute. Yeah. People used to spray their lures with WD-40.
I hate bringing up information because
Tell me.
Like there's things, if you spray it, so I'll give you the long story in the shortest amount of time. Go swim in the ocean in salt water where there's freshwater pools coming up in springs. It looks cloudy and weird. It looks different. Same thing happens when you're in fresh water and you have a bait that has salt. Like iridescent, the water moves. It's odd. It's almost like oils or blood. So if you take a bait and you spray it with WD-40, the petroleum product hits the water, you can see you're basically putting toxic problem chemicals into your lake, which is terrible. But when it hits the water, you'll see the oil on top. When that bait's swimming, it's leaving like a vapor, a visual trail of the petroleum product coming off, and the fish will key into that. Males, and this is cool science, males visually normally have better vision than female bass. And I don't know if they're putting them up to like visual tests or how they do that, but they're very keen visually, and they fish with their lateral line, of course, but fish have great eyes, positioned well for feeding. And so sometimes when you're doing the scent is like the trail of the scent is coming off as oil. So it's not so much the scent, it may be visual. There's all kinds of hard baits now. They have hard baits that you can squeeze gel into like the ribs. Cause I know a lot of the new monster bass baits have ribs on the side. They have gel that you can squeeze onto that. And as that swims through the water, that's slowly eroding off and peeling off and displacing something in the water visually. The scent, back to that specific question, is it worth it? If you put scent on a worm and you catch your PB, I'm just going to tell you, you're going to be putting scent on the rest of your worms for the rest of your life. That's just the easiest answer. If it works for you in your body of water, it gives you that upper edge. And I'll tell you what, if it makes you fish more confidently and you cast and you're ready for the bite and you set the hook because you're more in tune with it, then put scent in your bait. And that's all I can tell you. If you're throwing a plastic with no scent and you're fishing with that same intent and you're ready and you do everything important enough to catch that fish, then maybe you don't need the scent. But I don't know. I'm just going to tell you, if it helps you, do it. Give it a shot.
Agree. Yeah. I agree. Thanks for calling.
Okay, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
You got it.
Yeah, hope it helps. Get some fish.
Yeah.
He's probably pre-spawn. He's probably up to where the water's. Are you still on? What's your temperature? Do you know your normal fishing hole, what the water temperature is right now?
82. We're going to go to the next caller because we already hung up.
Good. All right.
Let's go to this guy who is reeling from this weekend's WrestleMania. He could be happy, could be sad. Go ahead.
You know how we finish the story, baby.
Okay. All right.
Let's hear it.
I was rooting for Cody. You know that.
I'm sorry.
Hey, so I do have a question for you. And this is a topic that me and some co-anglers have been talking about here recently. During the spawn, say you catch a female that still has eggs. How important is it to let her go close to where her bed is?
Oh, now you're getting all sentimental on me. So this is the hardest part. Like, you take a fish that's 5+, it's going to help you in the tournament. You take it off the bed. Was it just about to lay the eggs? Had it just laid the eggs? At what point because you're never going to get all the eggs out in one dose. And so you just have no idea to know what you're doing to that fish in the lifespan of its spawn. It could be on its second discharge of eggs. It could be on its first. You could take it and put it in your live well now with warmer water because it's just from the surface. And your live well cycling water from 10, 12 inches down where it's drawing it into your boat. And it was down at 4 feet. Now the water that you got in your live well, you go to a back area and the water's like 75 degrees and it was in 60 degrees. There's so many variables. Just know that you're doing something to that fish that's not natural. And so that's the realization of what we're doing as anglers is I can't sit here and tell you exactly how bad it is, but I can't tell you like taking it back is you're going to put that fish back in the water that's now been in a different barometric pressure. Its air bladder is different.
It can't be good no matter what.
Yeah. And that's the reality. We're fishing in a sport. Go ahead.
What I'm saying though is if say you're just out casually fishing, and you catch a female that's on a bed with eggs, do you want to try to release her at that moment, close to her bed, or does it matter where you throw her in?
I'd put her right back. Put her right back. No, 100%. You watch them. So this is where you get into these other things that I hate bringing them up, but I think it's important. People will catch the male off the bed if they've already paired up and courting a female, and that female is hanging out 6, 8, 10 feet away from that bed. Sometimes at the same depth, but over deeper water, you can catch the male, put in your live well, and the female will go up and now bed and protect, and you can catch the female. I don't love that. I don't condone it. I'm not going to sit here and say you're a bad person if you do it. If you need to catch the big fish to win a tournament, that is a way. Kayak bass fishing, people used to catch the fish and they'd put them on a donkey leash and hold the male in hopes that the female would come up.
Wait a minute.
You can donkey leash. Well, it's the same thing as if you're in a boat and you take the male and you put it in your live well. And then you're like, oh, I'm going to hold this fish for one of my 5. And then you catch the female and then you call out and you get rid of the male. So you can hold the male off the bed in hopes that it brings the female up. The cool part, when you do let the fish go and you're close and you do it fast, it almost always swims right back to that same bed. So if they're keyed into that, you're just kind of bugging them, and nature's going to win every time. You catch a fish quickly, you release it. You got to remember, you've exhausted a fish. And if it's the male, it is not eating. You've exhausted calories needed for the spawn and protection of the fry, and they've exerted that energy trying to get off your hook. And so you've definitely done that stress to that fish. So I'm not sitting here like, don't go fish during the spawn, because this is an awesome time, especially if you need to catch a fish. If you need to catch a fish to feed your family, I'm never going to be the guy that says fish are more important than humans. I'm sorry, but we do need fish. So we need to understand protecting fish and the fisheries. That's an important part of being a human on this planet. So yeah, it's good. I'd say let it go. Let it go as close to that bed as you can. Maybe tell it sorry.
Yeah, that's what I normally do. But I had an older angler that I was fishing with not too long ago, and he said, "Oh, it doesn't matter. You just throw it back in, it'll go back over there." I'm like, "You're already 100 yards away from where you caught it." Yeah. I was like, you should take it back over there, because at the time it was about a 6.5 pound full of eggs, and we were fishing 50 yards off the bank, casting to the bank, come back top water. Yep.
That's awesome.
And so
no, that old angler,
it don't matter. I'm like, yeah, it does.
It used to not matter. There were so many fish, and I tell you, he probably used to eat a lot of bass. Maybe back when he was younger, that old angler, like, you catch a big fish, you brought it home and you ate it for dinner. And that's something that we're trying to figure this all out, because bass fishing has definitely changed. The pressure on fisheries, we need to make sure we're protecting the fish and doing our best that we can. That whole question of like where to release them, it goes a nightmare into the tournament fishing, where you have 200 boats bringing back their 5 best fish all to the boat ramp. And then now they're like, some tournaments are doing a good job, is they're taking the fish and they're putting them into a boat and they're taking them back out. But then that opens up the can of worms of like, maybe they're taking their honey hole, and then only the tournament director and his friend go and fish.
Yeah.
It's like, it's so funny what goes on in bass fishing. But if you're out fishing and you catch a fish near a bed, just do your best to put it back so it can go in, and nature takes its course.
Yeah. Great question, T-Rex.
Great question. Yeah. Really cool.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, fellas. I appreciate your time.
You got it, man.
One more quick question. You do talk about reading about all the scientific stuff and all that, and I would be interested in reading some of that. When you get a chance, can you send me a link or something on Messenger or whatever?
Yeah, that's fun. There's a YouTube video.
Thank you.
I'll send it to you. There's a cool guy. It's probably the most boring science thing ever to listen to, and no discredit to him, but had the most information. It's like a 2-hour pre-spawn up to the mating of the spawn, and this guy's voice will put you to sleep. But I'll get that link. This is all people do, is they have a degree in fish spawning, and so it's pretty incredible, the information that people gather. So super fun.
Before we get on to my next question,
all right.
I just have to say one comment. I have to read a comment that was in the chat. It was hilarious. Blind Eye Fishing said, "You get snatched out of the bed all naked and thrown on the floor, you'd be pissed too."
I'm telling you, it's funny because my wife and I were teasing, and you catch a young feisty male up by the shore, and you pick it up, and oftentimes it looks like it's peeing. Well, that's not pee. And that's this whole thing of like, if Raphie was here, we could, I know you could never get through this conversation.
Never.
What's going on. So that fish is ready to fertilize eggs. And that's what's happening under the stress of when you take a male fish out of the water right at the spawn, is its happiest times are happening right there on your boat. So it's just an interesting concept of like how how dastardly are we involved in nature, and what are we really doing? And because there's thousands of fish spawning and they're laying 80,000 eggs, like we're all going to be okay, but we just got to, take some responsibility for what we're doing when we're fishing.
Sure. So, all right, T-Rex, thanks for calling in, man. I appreciate it. Okay. Man, there's a lot of people chatting in the chat.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I don't fish on beds. I just fish offshore. I think that's the good. Hey, I'm just going to go fish. I'm not going to target a bed fish. That funny concept of like ripping somebody out of their bed. It's exactly what's going on. When you're talking about people harvesting fish, I think it's important to harvest fish in a fishery that's overcrowded. But sure, I would not condone harvesting a female that is ready to lay all these eggs. And so those are those things like we still need the ability to harvest that other food source and bring those calories up. And if you want to harvest fish and eat them and you figure out the relative weight of your fish, by all means. There, a guy, Oliver, is all over Big Bass Dreams.
Yeah, I saw that.
He's cooking fish and it's hilarious what's going on. And it's just re-educating people. I love what he's doing for fishing because we just need to know what's going on and make true educated decisions. So the spawn discussion of fishing or not fishing is important. You go to protected waters, there's no fishing during the spawn. Some rivers just don't allow it. It's like, you're not doing it. And I mentioned, like, if you're fishing during the spawn, they might key your car or slash your tires at certain rivers.
Yeah.
It's not the fishery management doing that. It's the anglers. And maybe it's misguided and maybe they don't know what's going on, but that's this whole thing of like protecting your fishery. I think it's smart. The more you know, the better off we're all going to be.
Yeah, sounds like a public service announcement. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone that's tuning in, whether it's your first time or your 100th time. Smash that thumbs up button. Let us know that you like the show. And if you're watching this on Rewind, you can subscribe wherever you consume your favorite podcast. Let us know. Let us know in the comments what your thoughts are. I guess at this point, what I'd love to know, like, what are your top 5 baits that you like to fish during the spawn?
I love it. That's easy. So I'll go from pre-spawn. Fish are staged up. Thinking of that truck stop. Got some of the biggest fish. I want a really easy bait that's something slow, that's something simple that can fall right in front of their face. And I mentioned using a Cinco. It's probably my go-to during that time where the fish are kind of lethargic. They're not moving. I've used really big swim baits. So you think of a soft plastic swim bait. My lake specifically, we plant trout and the trout start to die off as the water gets warmer. So now we have these bass that are moving up, trout that are dying off. I could throw swim baits and let them fall and swim down. So as long as there's a boot tail on it, I've used swim jigs and it's almost like dead sticking. So if I could throw something big, easy to eat, that's slow moving right in front of those staging fish, that's number one bait for me.
Tell me sticking. Hold on.
Dead sticking. I throw a bait and I don't even move it. I throw it, whether it's like
just let it drop.
Laziest, easiest. So I go out and I'll take my nephews out and they're fishing with. I did this like a week ago and we had just some Cincos and they were Neko rigged. So they have a nail weight in the nose and it falls kind of quick at an angle and it goes to the bottom and it sits there. And I caught a fish. I was showing them, I set them all up, caught a fish in my first cast. And then they all throw it and they're moving the baits and they're wiggling the poles and they're moving things too fast and they're not catching fish. And I said, don't do anything. Just maybe set the rod down. As soon as they stopped moving, those fish just kind of cruise over. They pick up the bait. And so that dead stick idea, the dead fish, the crawdad, whatever it may be, not even moving the bait, that gets eaten a lot pre-spawn, just because if it's a swim bait and you're barely twitching it or barely moving a creature bait, whatever it may be, it needs to be easy because those fish don't want to waste a lot of energy. So that's that pre-spawn simple go-to, catches fish all the time. My favorite way to catch fish during this whole spawn is if you could get top water, if it gets warm enough, like a pad crasher, thinking of like a poppin' perch. You think of like the boy fish is up shallow and he's protecting the bed, and you think of these bait fish coming over and kind of bugging them. If you can get some top water action going, that's an absolute blast, because that's my favorite way to catch fish. And I know that's most anglers' favorite way. So that takes you spawn and almost post spawn when they're protecting, moves into protecting the fry. Swim baits, I mean, you're talking a bluegill swimming into a fry ball to eat baby bass Daddy bass is so mad at you, he's just going to come and eat you.
Mm.
Super fun way to catch a fish. So bluegill, swim baits, glide baits, all of that, tons of fun. Same thing, jerk bait. I use a jerk bait pre-spawn and then post-spawn. Jerk bait into the fry ball, but also jerk bait suspended and super slow. And it's just an easy meal. So the bass, they see it, they hear it, it's making noise, and then you can pause it and they're like, probably just go eat that thing. And so as that jerk bait's kind of floating, if it's slow sinking, a lot of times you'll get the fish on the pause. So the other thing is an easy one to cover water, and I think you just came out with one, is a spinner bait. And a spinner bait is awesome with a Colorado blade and lighter weight, just so it's lighter. You can retrieve it slower. The Colorado blade has more resistance in the water. So hydrodynamically, it's holding back and it allows you to reel it and almost slow crawl it and pull it back towards your reel. So spinnerbait covers a bunch of water. Colorado blade, it's more of a thump. It's a little louder. Fish are going to hear it. So if you get fish that you want to cover water, you want to entice with a moving bait, spinnerbait is the way to go. And then last is creature
Don't
bait.
tell me.
Okay. I'll wait. Yeah.
Don't
Okay,
tell me.
all right.
Only because so far, like, you've named every bait that I've got coming in the next box.
You're excited, right? You're like, and it's
Yeah,
funny
so
because
far I'm like, okay, so my picks are pretty good. What?
it's like-
What's your last one?
So the last one, this is important for bed fishing. And I just want to tell people this bed fishing, whether I'm condoning it or not, I want to educate you about bed fishing. Bass fishing has gotten so sensitive to snagging fish versus catching them that they actually will have a judge on the boats. And when you catch a fish, you have to show the referee that the fish was caught in the mouth. And I don't know the exact story, but it's so cool with the integrity of an angler. He knew, I guess he realized it later, but he didn't have any hook holes in the lips of the fish. And he realized, I don't think I caught that in the fish's mouth. And he basically penalized himself and he lost a whole bunch of money, which somebody in the chat, like, tell us who that was. Cause like, hats off to that guy, like being honest, integrity, that's the coolest thing ever. But if you're going to bed fish, and I mentioned throwing like some kind of weird bait or throwing a buzz bait into the bed. If you want to make sure the bait gets in the fish's mouth, throw a smaller bait. And that's just the easiest way. Lightweight, Kelly's the queen of this, and it's not even on purpose. It's more accident. If you drop shot and your weight's down below and it's separate, and then you have your bait and it's floating, whether it's a tiny little fish or a worm, that fish puffs its gills and that whole bait goes in its mouth. If the bait is next to the weight, or you're using a really heavy bait, or like some people are like, oh, use a big long snake. A fish can grab the back end of a snake and pull it out of its bed, and the hook is way down by the weight. So if you're using a bait, consider lighter weight, consider smaller for bed fishing, just to kind of, you're just making the fish mad, and it needs to pick it up and it needs to move it out of the bed. And if you're doing that, a smaller bait has a better chance of hooking it in the face. And hook in the face is two-part. One is you have a much better chance of landing that fish because you can control the fish. So if it's mouth hooked, it's way better to fight. When it's foul hooked on the side, you have the full leverage of the side of that fish swimming away from you. It's really hard to fight and manage a fish side or foul hooked. Also, when you cut a fish like that and it's open to sores and bacteria, especially during the spawn, their metabolic rate's not that great because they're not eating. You have a really good chance of harming that fish if you foul hook it. So it's kind of two-part there. Easier to catch if it's mouth hooked, but also way better for the fish. Tons and tons of information with the spawn though. And you can have some of the best days fishing and not even know you're fishing spawning beds. That's the irony, is the deeper they can spawn deeper in clearer water. And so thinking of the sun penetrating, when we go fish the Delta, we're fishing along the shoreline of the Delta, and coming up next month is Windy Wednesdays. And so you're fishing dirty water. You can't tell if the fish are spawning in a foot to 2 feet because the water's so dirty. So you're probably throwing right over beds way more often than you realize. And you're catching spawning fish more often than you realize. And so that's just that matter of, okay, how am I doing this? What baits am I throwing? And having the education really helps, key into those fish.
And so then I'm assuming that the honorable mention is going to go, like, at some point it's going to go to a crankbait, because it's after they're done, they're going to go look for another place to go suspend and sit, and you want to cover some water and go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, well, a crankbait works all the time, and I'll tell you, crankbait, I don't use it a bunch where I live because the there's so much grass and so much
Mm.
debris. If you imagine a crankbait, and if you think of a rocky shoreline and the fish have pea gravel, and here comes this little tiny bluegill beating its nose against the bottom and it's coming by a bed, there's nothing that's going to make a bass more mad than that. So if you can get a crankbait to come through a bed and maybe even pause it and then wiggle and dig deeper into that bed, I'm going to eat you if I'm a bass. So, and then as soon as that post spawn changes and that metabolic rate for the females and the hormone dispersion stops and they get rid of the hormones to breed, all they want to do is feed. And so they've got to replenish their bodies. They've got to eat. And so that's this whole thing is like, where does a fish live in the summer? Where's its eating grounds? And what is the main forage for these big bass? Oftentimes it is some kind of smaller fish. Your crankbait, they're looking for an easy meal. Throw that crankbait.
So I would think that off the beds, right? Like, why wouldn't I chuck an old school Carolina rig or a Texas rig, throw it on the other side of the bed and just drag it right through the middle?
That's what people do. I mean, honestly, they're target fishing. You can try outside of the bed. Oftentimes, if you go too far outside of the bed, the fish will recognize it. It recognizes it. It's not really friend. It's not foe. It's more forgettable. It's not food. And so if you go too far off the bed and kind of sneak it into the bed, the fish is like, I've decided that's nothing right now. And then it lets it go through the bed. If you throw right onto the bed and it noses down, you think of like a Ned rig or some kind of a swim bait nose hooked, and you got these ball jigs that everyone's fishing offshore right now. Those same horizontal presentations, they fall and then they nose right down to the bed and these eggs. Those are gonna be a great way to catch bedfish. People talk about pink worms, just stuff that's crazy and weird and bright and whatever. A lot of that, again, you're catching a fish, not eating. You're making a fish mad. So visually, they need to get your bait off their bed. And so it's interesting. You look at a fish that's spawning and cleared the bed. It's just trying to keep it clean. Once the eggs are there and it's got like this milky little gray discoloration, now it wants nothing to be. And you'll watch the males, they really lock in on the nest right then. And you can tell they've got eggs because they're fanning with their side fins, holding them. Basically, they're pushing water backwards because their back fin and their under fin, I don't even know what it's called, are moving them forward. And what they're doing is they're fanning, keeping the dust and sediment off the eggs. So they're locked spot on their nest. After a couple days, they start venturing out and chasing bluegill and things. So once you see what they're specifically doing on their bed, you'll know if there's eggs in there. You'll know what the best chance of catching them, what kind of baits to use.
This is good information. Good information. We got another caller, so let's take this call and see what we got. Go ahead, Charlie.
Hey, guys.
What's going on, man?
Charlie.
Oh, sorry, Matt Brown.
No, son. I was like, Charlie, man. I didn't know my name changed. How you guys doing this evening?
We're good.
We're good.
So I was loving that you were talking about going smaller profile on bedding fish. And we talked about guys that'll throw the giant, swim baits that are bluegill colored. Rick made a point. My favorite thing to throw right now, and especially to catch a bass that's either just staging off a bed, or is really kind of getting to that point where she's about to commit to eat and target that bigger female instead of getting the male that's on the bed that's usually the smaller bass, is I love to throw a bluegill crankbait.
Yep.
Like I'll throw a square bill, I'll throw something, and I like to make it loud. So I'll usually throw like big hooks on it, something make it rattle, make a big presentation. But that bluegill, one, it's kind of that friend foe thing.
Yeah.
It's like a lizard during spawn. I don't know, Chris, if you've ever thrown a lizard or something like that.
Yeah.
You get that,
big creature bait
response.
Yeah. No, big creature baits, lizards. I'll tell you what, it's this cool thing that you're doing is you're taking a bait, and these fish, they don't really have a big brain, and it's got this now crankbait swimming by it. And if the female fish hasn't fully committed to go to spawn, like you're saying, and it sees that, and that crankbait hits something and deflects, and it looks like a wounded fish, that bass still historically has to eat that. And that's its genetic code. It's predisposed. It's funny because I always tease people, like, what you just described is you've taken the thought process out of this bass and you force fed it. You made it react to that bait. The bait did exactly what it needed to do, whether it paused, it hit a branch, it hit a rock, it deflected. That crankbait is perfect for that. And that bass had no other option but to eat it. And so that's why you catch so many fish with that bait. It's an amazing bait. And it's not the fish's fault. It's just pre-wired to eat fish that are wounded or dying or moving. And so you've played into that. It's their instinct. It's awesome.
Exactly. And I love that, so that pre-spawn, so that instinctive reaction is what you're really having to go on into this phase where we're talking spawn. Because, they're not eating, they're not super aggressive, they're pretty lethargic, they're prepping their bodies to do what they need to do and reproduce. And so if we can get that reaction, in front of the fish and do something a little funky, that pause, that change, but, identify those little small caveat details that make that fish want to bite and either aggressively fight off the fish. A small bass crankbait works great right now. Anything that's going to make a competitive streak kick up, or anything that's going to make that fish go, I don't want you here, and I'm going to make sure you're not staying around.
Yeah.
And that's when you get those reaction strikes.
Yeah, I didn't go into it like the staging fish. When I'm fishing a worm, it's a lot harder to tell that they took the bait, because when they're in that pre-spawn staging spot, they'll actually bring the worm in their mouth and they don't normally relocate. They don't displace. You don't see your line moving. You don't really feel the bite. So when they're doing that reaction bite, a lot of times they'll even bite at the crankbait and they don't take off running away from their friends because they grabbed a fish. They sometimes will bite it. And then you watch underwater footage, they'll actually open their mouth as quick as they can. Luckily with the crankbait, you normally have 2 sharp treble hooks, so your chances of getting them are good. But it is that thing where you're kind of outsmarting the fish and you're playing to it just has to eat. And that's the game that you've done.
It's instinctual behaviors.
Yep. That's it. So what you're doing, playing Mother Nature on the side. The more you understand, the more you learn, the better chance you're armed to catch them. So good job on figuring that one out.
Absolutely.
Good stuff,
awesome,
man.
Love it, guys. Well, it was great talking to y'all. I'm about to actually walk into a church meeting, so have fun, and we'll holler at you next week.
Say some prayers for us. We'll see you.
All right, we'll try. We'll see y'all.
Dude, I want everybody praying for it. No matter, I always tell people that, like, no matter what religion they are, wherever they're going, like, dude, we all say prayers for each other. That's how that world works. That's awesome. No, that's spot on. Like you're talking about crankbaits. I really think you can get a fish to react to almost any bait. And if you think about the fish and where they're at, you might have to change the presentation a little bit. You might have to reel the crankbait a little faster, a little slower, but you're putting something out there that looks like food almost always with bass fishing. And it's like a great time of year, like springtime. I'm going to use a bladed jig. I'm going to throw the chatterbait. Well, how do you fish the chatterbait is the question that I always ask people. It's like, yeah, chatterbait can work, but maybe you have to swim it a little lower. You might need to almost bounce it or slowly crawl it and get the wiggle right off the bottom and let it fall back down. If the fish are not reacting super fast to just a cast and reel chatterbait, you might be able to do really, really good work with the chatterbait, but actually have to change the presentation. So I'm all about knowing what the fish are looking for. And then my favorite is to go through a myriad of baits and try to get fish to react to 2 or 3 different styles, but catching the same fish that are staged in the same spot. So it's kind of fun.
I love it. Do we, I feel like I've learned more tonight. Well, forget the marine biologist. I mean, that guy was.
It's too much. He's too smart.
That was a little too much for me. He's way too smart. But I feel like in terms of the spawn, I mean, it all makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know how I feel about the beds.
Yeah. What do you? So come on, just gut feeling reaction. Is it okay to pull a fish right out of bed?
I feel like there's plenty of fish in the water. Why do I need to go do that? I mean, look, if I was fishing a tournament, that's one thing. And if the rules allowed me to do it, I mean, either I shouldn't be in the tournament you know, but I don't know. It just seems like it's counterproductive for just fun, Saturday afternoon recreational fishing.
Yeah, it's hard because I mean, we have some
I don't know.
local kids, and I'm always like, "Hey, do you really need to fish right on top of the bed?" And here's the hardest part: when you see like a 6 or 7 pound female, and she hangs out on the bed for a week, and I watch 3 kids like throwing bait after bait after bait, and it's right by the dock where my boat is, and they'll catch it. And then the next day, I got 3 more kids, bait after bait
Yeah, yeah,
after
yeah.
bait. Same fish. It's like, but they don't know the kids were there the day before, so you can't hold that
True.
against them. And they just want to catch their first
True.
6 pounder.
And they're 12 or whatever.
And they're
Because if
12,
I was
like,
12, I'm like, listen, old man, I want to catch my 6-pound bass.
no, it's like, and you don't want to tell them like that's like sacred time. It's like happy time that the fish are together, but you don't want to tell a 12-year-old that. It's like, don't worry about that stuff. So just go catch fish. So yeah, I understand this whole deal of like, as you get older, the more you know, change our behaviors, maybe understand. It is really cool to that if anyone can go away with this tonight, not all fish spawn at the same time. So if you don't want to catch a bedfish, know that there's still fish staging, even when there's fish on beds. There's fish that have already spawned that are ready to eat and they're healthy and they're fine. Then there's also fish that will not spawn that year. And I don't know why. And science, it's not like we're going to get to call them up and say, hey, why aren't you spawning this year? There's still plenty of fish to catch. So if you don't want to fish for fish on the bed, just go catch some fish. You'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's really good information. We got one last question for you, Chris. So how far will bass in small rivers migrate to spawn since there are no shallow flats or coves? Where do they go and spawn?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because they're gonna rivers have an area where a fish, and you got to figure out current, you got to figure out eddy lines, and this is like my fly fishing days.
What's an eddy line?
So an eddy line, if you've got a rock in the current and the current is coming and it goes around that rock and deflects it, right in front of that rock, there's an actual pillow of water, and the biggest fish will sit right there. Or behind the rock, the water actually curls backwards and is coming back upstream. So you have these eddy lines and eddies.
So they can just suspend and sit right there. They don't have to exert energy because the water's doing all the work.
The water just sits there. Yeah. And what's cool is the really smart fish sit behind the rocks and they feed in that eddy line. They come out, they sit there where there's no energy needed. The water's rushing by them on the side of the rock. And then they just go over and they eat something. Then they come back and rest and go over and eat something. It's really cool. So there'll always be a spot where a fish can lay its eggs, bass specifically, whether it's smallmouth, whatever. And rivers, when you get right at the bottom as well, the current is not just running right across the rock. So there's all those eddy lines on the bottom. So even though it looks like the river's running, that's why a lot of fish will hold directly on the bottom. They can lay their eggs on the bottom, and right at the level where those eggs are, they'll dig out and move around the gravel. So they'll make like a little pool or a low point. The water's moving above that. So it's not washing the eggs down the river. So they can still find the habitat that has the right temperature, that they can have the eggs not get washed down river. They can still spawn. And believe me, fish are smart. They're going to figure it out. They've been doing this since way before we were here as people, or however this has all worked out. I mean, it's been millennia. However, whether your beliefs are that this came from a big bang or God figured it all out, like it's been figured out. It's working. And fish, I swear, if you take bass and put them in a tiny pond, it doesn't seem like they can swim and find the right water. They'll stage underneath a branch and they'll wait and hover there trying to feed before they move up to the shoreline in a pond. So when you look at these tiny little ecosystems, the bass will figure it out pretty quick, and they'll make good work of it.
Love it.
Very resilient.
Love it. I love it. Well, thanks for giving us all that knowledge today. I mean, I know for one that I feel like I could be a little more effective fishing the spawn than I was before watching this show. So
that's the goal. That's always the goal. Yeah. Understanding if they pre-spawn, are they spawning, are they on beds, are they post-spawn? Where do I want to catch them? Where do I feel good about it? Now you're armed with some info. I mean, I'm telling you, you give out the baits every month. And I know there's the cool video that came out and it was like tied into the top baits for the spawn. When you're educating people about where the fish are and their behaviors, tying them into the right baits is key. And you're arming people through Monster Bass. That's the fun part. Is I share this, the box, take baits you normally wouldn't use and apply it and decide, like, are these fish in pre-spawn? Are they up on the beds? Maybe a spinnerbait is the new future of bed fishing. I don't know. Big old Colorado blade. like burbling down and wiggling and landing on the bed, and you wiggle that thing, maybe that'll work like a buzz bait. The buzz bait, I can drop the name. Cody Meyer was out fishing where I live with some friends, and these guys are from Australia, and they're like, hey, this bed over here, I'm going to show you something. I'm like, you guys are crazy. He's like, no, a double bladed buzz bait is the best for a bed fish. And I'm like, you guys are smoking something weird from Australia. And he walked over and he just threw this buzz bait right in the bed, and the fish came over, picked it up, and pulled it away. And it was just like, okay, and I love that thinking outside of the box when you're sending people baits in a box. And now we got these cool gusseted bags.
Sure.
Try whatever you got. I mean, try the monster bass stuff across the board on the fish in different locations, and maybe you'll come up with this magic answer. So, and then share it with us, because I love it.
Yeah, you're not wrong. And Cotton, you now have no excuses to not win your next tournament. I mean, I've sent you the right baits. We gave you all the tips to fish. So all I expect to do is get a phone call next week with you hosting a trophy and, you know, some pictures of a big check or whatever Publishers Clearinghouse does. So
yeah,
no excuses.
So that's all we want.
No excuses.
We don't need
Cotton.
No thanks. The thanks is simply you holding the trophy and saying,
That's right.
I did it. That's all we want to see. Yeah,
That's right.
that's cool.
So, all right, man. Well, listen, we are going to, I know we go usually a little 5:30, but I've got a birthday dinner to get to, and I feel like we've gone through everything that we wanted to. And so with that, I'm going to give you some time back, Chris, so you can get with your family. I mean, it is spawning season, so maybe,
Hey,
you know,
we're
I don't
done
know.
spawning. No, done spawning around here. No, that's
Well,
we'll never. You never know, right? You never know. Give me a late spawner. My
Right.
wife's gonna murder me. So no, get back out there. Get the spawning people. Do your thing. And I mean, it's been fun. Go fish,
Yes.
catch fish. Don't feel guilty. You catch a fish up on a bed. Let it go. Put it back. Hey, nature's gonna figure it all out. We'll all be okay.
It'll all work out in the end.
Heck yeah, it always does. No,
All
thanks,
right.
Rick. Enjoy the birthday. Thanks for everybody joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. All right. Bye, guys.
See you.